Thank you. So hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us this Friday afternoon. Looking forward to having a little bit of an engagement with you after I give you an overview of my research, which we've entitled this session, The Endangering Cost of Development. And it actually focuses on the issue of development and how it impacts on Indigenous and tribal peoples. So this is a very specific area of international law, the rights of Indigenous and tribal peoples. But having said that, it actually touches on all areas of law that you are likely to come into contact with over the course of your legal studies. So if you think, for example, of contract law, then you come across issues like obtaining the free, prior and informed consent of communities and entering into agreements with them based on this. If you think of tort law, then the issue of holding businesses responsible when they impact on the lands and environment of communities comes into play. If you think of property law, then very clearly issues around land rights and even intellectual property rights come into play. Environmental law, very relevant to this area of Indigenous peoples because the issue of biodiversity and sustainable development is a topic that is very much related to their lands and their ways of life. And of course, international human rights law addresses these groups, these Indigenous and tribal peoples, and recognizes that they have distinct collective rights over their lands that are different from the individual rights that we normally associate with international human rights law. And so this study of Indigenous and tribal people's rights, actually, it ties back to the beginnings of international law, because when colonial states started to claim territories overseas, they had to try to justify these claims through law. And they created this system of international law that other states would recognize their claims. But part of that was actually engaging with the peoples who were in those lands that they went to. And these peoples, today we call them the Indigenous peoples, the native peoples, they were present in these lands, and sometimes they were able to resist encroachment. So the colonial powers had to enter into treaties with them, and those treaties still very much alive today and are embodied in the laws of various countries. And in other cases, like in Australia, for example, the British, when they went there, they said, there's nobody here. This is no man's land. And they had this concept of terra nullius. And right up until 1992, this concept was recognized in Australia until the courts said for the first time, actually, Aboriginal peoples have a title over their lands and are entitled to claim those lands based on their customary laws. So this is a very interesting area, an evolving area of law. And what I'd like to do now is go through two pieces of research that I've been involved with in the past 2 years. The first one was with the United Nations, and it looked at the challenges that Indigenous peoples face in relation to realizing their rights. And the second piece of research that I'm going to give you a little overview of was together with an organization called Forest Peoples Program, that's an NGO that works in this area, and Yale University Law Clinic students who were working on human rights issues. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll go quickly through some of this research to give you a sense of it, and then we can have a discussion after that about it. Let's hope this screen sharing is working. So you should see now a title screen that says Endangering the Cost of Development. So I have been working in this area of Indigenous people's rights for nearly 20 years now and published quite a lot of books on it. And this, as I said, it's a topic that crosses a whole spectrum of issues. So if you're interested in this, afterwards you can contact me and I'm happy to share some more thoughts and give you some more information on it. But something that you might find interesting after the session as well is maybe to look up some movies and documentaries that address the stories of Indigenous people, historical stories, but also their current realities, because this is fascinating material. If you just look on that slide, you'll see I've put a few stills from different movies or documentaries. The Last Mohican, some of you may have seen, but you probably haven't seen the other one called Utopia, which is about the situation of Aboriginal peoples in Australia. And it's a documentary made by John Pilger, but it's really startling, the situation of these peoples who have one of the oldest civilizations in their own lands, and how they're treated, and they're, you know, subject to incarceration, poverty, discrimination. So it's a topic that, if you're interested in law as justice and trying to use the law for justice, this is an area that might really engage you. So I think a good starting point in all this is to ask, well, who are Indigenous peoples? And there isn't any one definition of Indigenous peoples, because there are thousands of different Indigenous peoples around the world, and no one definition would be sufficient to capture that diversity of peoples. But there are criteria. The United Nations has come up with a series of criteria. And among these criteria are the fact that these are peoples who have a very strong connection with their lands. So they associate themselves with where they're from, their place, and they want to maintain that link with their lands. So they have a historical connection with those lands, and they want to pass that connection on to the next generations. They want to preserve their own unique cultural identity and to continue to exist as peoples who have their own institutions, their own legal systems. And quite often, and this is very important, they're often non-dominant groups in society. So they're generally groups that are discriminated against, disadvantaged, and find themselves in very vulnerable situations. And so this brings me to the two reports that I mentioned. There's a definition there you can look at yourselves afterwards. But the two reports that I've been involved in over the past 2 or 3 years are there on the slide. And one of them is a report that was commissioned by the United Nations. It's a report that every 2 years the UN develops to look at the situation of Indigenous peoples in the world. And this report that came out this year that I was involved in writing looked at the challenges that they face in relation to their lands, territories, and resources. So it's a very core issue. When you think about Indigenous peoples, as I said, one of the first things that comes to mind is that relationship with lands, right? The other report then is a more recent report. So that I finished the first one back at the end of, just before the pandemic started. Myself and a number of researchers finished that report looking at the challenges facing Indigenous peoples around their land rights. Then the pandemic started, and of course there were huge impacts on all of us, but particular impacts on Indigenous communities. And not only the impacts of the pandemic, but the impacts of governments using the pandemic as a pretext to roll back or to reduce the protections that are afforded to Indigenous peoples. So together with an NGO and Yale University's Law Clinic, we did some research looking at what those impacts are. So I've got about 20 minutes to give you a kind of an overview of these two reports. I'll share the links with you afterwards so you can go and read them, and maybe this might be something that sparks an interest for you. But I'll start off with the report on the state of the world's Indigenous peoples and the challenges faced by Indigenous peoples throughout the world. So as I said, that report looked at lands, territories, and resources, and this is really at the core of Indigenous peoples' identity and at the core of their survival as peoples, right? And human rights law, recognizes this. It recognizes that the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples are fundamental to their status as peoples. And so it says you have collective rights over these lands based on the fact that you possess these lands since time immemorial, and that you are a people who hold a right to self-determination. So that's the right to decide your own futures and to decide what happens in your lands. Okay? And over the course of the last decades, international law, and in particular international human rights law, has evolved to recognize a body of rights that pertain to Indigenous peoples. And a number of states have incorporated these rights into their constitutions or their legislation. And if you want some examples of this, I would suggest taking a look at the constitutions of Brazil or Colombia or Ecuador, or look at the law in the Philippines called the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act or India's Forest Rights Act. And there you'll see that there's a recognition of the collective rights over those lands and territories and resources of these peoples. And not only that, but courts, national courts, and particular courts such as the Constitutional Court in Colombia or the Constitutional Court in Indonesia have made very important decisions about the need for the state to implement these rights. So it's not enough just to have the rights on paper or in your constitution, they have to be implemented in practice. However, there are many states throughout the world, and in particular in Asia and Africa, that have not even recognized that there are Indigenous peoples in their jurisdiction. And as a result of this combination of the failure to recognize these peoples, but also the failure to protect their rights in practice, what we're seeing is that these peoples are threatened by development projects entering into their lands, and their very survival is at risk. So there's a series of challenges facing Indigenous peoples. And to put this into context, it's important to remember that Indigenous peoples' lands are often those places where we find the richest mineral resources. And that's because they're located in upland areas or areas in forest and jungle areas where resources have not been exploited historically. And so the minerals, the oil, the gas, the wood, the hydroelectric, the water needed for hydroelectric power, that's all located in these areas. And estimates of about 50% of the world's mineral resources are estimated to be located in the lands of Indigenous peoples. And we're talking about 5% of the world's population. We take all the Indigenous peoples together, it's about 5% of the world's population. So straight away, you can see they're disproportionately impacted by activities like mining, like oil and gas activities, logging. And there's an irony here because a huge percentage of the world's biodiversity is located in the lands of these peoples. And so it's critical for not just their survival, but all our survival if their lands are protected. However, instead of protecting their lands, what we see is that they are criminalized, they're threatened and killed at alarming rates for just trying to defend their lands. When these people try to stop encroachment into their land, that's what happens. So mining, oil and gas, forestry, these are big, big activities that impact on these groups. And if I give you just an example, in the Philippines, over 70% of the large-scale mining applications are located in Indigenous peoples' territories. While in Peru, around 75% of the Amazon is covered in oil and gas concessions, and these are the areas where Indigenous peoples live. So it's not just mining, oil and gas and forestry that are impacting on the Indigenous peoples. Alarmingly, the whole move towards clean energy and a sustainable future and the objective that we all have to transition from fossil fuels to wind and solar is also disproportionately impacting on Indigenous peoples. And this is because, again, we find the lands that are used for this type of energy, for the generation of solar energy, for geothermal, for wind, are often in Indigenous peoples' territories again. And a classic example of this is the fact that the major sources of lithium that we need for batteries are located precisely in the lands of Indigenous peoples in Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, and they're also in the lands of the Tibetans. So the peoples who are most vulnerable and who have suffered the most discrimination and harm to their lands are yet again faced with another wave of this as a result of our transition to a sustainable and clean model of energy. So there's a real irony there. The other sector that is very much and increasingly impacting on Indigenous peoples is the agribusiness sector. So agribusiness, that's large scale agricultural, industrial agriculture. So agribusiness, if we think about cattle ranching, soybean plantations. These are the major drivers of deforestation in the Amazon in Indigenous peoples' territories. Another huge agribusiness sector is in the palm oil, the plantations of palm oil, oil palm plantations. And about 85% of those plantations are found in the lands of Indigenous peoples in Indonesia and Malaysia. So again, profound impacts. And I mentioned this, the irony of the transition to clean energy being disproportionately impacting on Indigenous peoples. And very similar sort of a process, the shift towards conservation and protection of biodiversity is also having a very profound impact on Indigenous peoples, because much of the world's intact and remaining biodiversity is in their lands. And instead of protecting their lands and their rights and recognizing that these peoples have actually maintained all that biodiversity and protected the lands so we have this situation, what's happening is conservation initiatives are evicting Indigenous peoples from their lands on the grounds that if you have people in these areas, then the biodiversity will be lost. But the reality is it's these peoples that have protected and maintained that biodiversity. So it's very alarming when we think that Indigenous peoples from around 50% of the world's protected areas that form part of their territories, they've been evicted from these areas, and often violently. And you see there is an image of guards that patrol conservation parks in areas such as Kenya and Thailand. And instead of just protecting these lands and keeping people out, what actually happens is tourists come in. So we have moving out of the original inhabitants and owners of these lands and protectors of those lands to facilitate tourism. And so this concept of development, we see it in the context of tourism, we see it in the context of mining industry, of agribusiness, hydroelectric projects, even conservation initiatives. It's having a huge impact on those groups who are the most vulnerable and who actually have the strongest claims over those lands. And it's not just the loss of land, but it's also the loss of life, because that land is very much connected with the life of the people. And when they attempt to defend those lands, they're incarcerated, they're threatened, there's criminalization, the law is used against them. Oftentimes they end up in front of judges and being accused of encroachment onto areas that were their own land, or mobilizing peoples, because the only power they have to make change is actually to mobilize and to protest. And we have seen each year the number of Indigenous land rights defenders who are killed rising at an alarming rate. And just in 2020 alone, there were around 200 Indigenous land rights defenders killed. And countries such as Colombia and the Philippines are particularly bad in this area, because we have some of the most alarming rates of killings in those countries. So that's really a kind of a snapshot of how Indigenous peoples were before the pandemic hit. So a very concerning picture. And you would think that in the context of a pandemic, global pandemic that we've all had to live through, that those groups who are in the most vulnerable situation would be the most protected by their governments. But unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. And what we have seen, starting very early on in the pandemic, Indigenous groups started to contact organizations such as Forest Peoples Programme and other allies that they have that work with them, saying that there were efforts by the governments to roll back the protections for their environment and their rights. So Forest Peoples Programme, Middlesex University and Yale University Law Clinic came together to try to do some systematic analysis of the situation and what was happening in countries where Indigenous peoples live in the forest. So we picked 5 countries. We picked the 5 most tropically forested countries in the world. And we asked this question. Sorry, the text has got a little bit skewed, but we asked the question, to what extent had the coronavirus impacted on these peoples as a result of governments rolling back protections for their rights, and what was the consequences for Indigenous peoples in these countries. And our findings were very, very stark, extremely alarming. We found that in each of the 5 countries, there had been rollbacks on Indigenous peoples' rights. Firstly, in the context of land use plans and macroeconomic plans, governments were justifying changes to these plans on the basis of the need to recover from the economic impact of COVID-19. Secondly, they were reducing the impact assessments and the consultation with these groups on the grounds that, well, you couldn't go into the territories to conduct these consultations. So instead of stopping the project, they were proceeding without actually engaging with the peoples. And thirdly, and this one is particularly alarming in countries such as Brazil, there's been an increasing impunity for illegal actors who enter into those lands and grab those lands for illegal mining and illegal logging activities. And then fourthly, we found that the level of violence and criminalization of Indigenous leaders was, instead of dropping during this time, was actually increasing. So very, very alarming findings. And really what we saw in this process was that what we were seeing was business as usual, so what I had described prior to the pandemic, but with its destructive impacts significantly intensified at exactly a time when Indigenous peoples and forest peoples were at their weakest and most vulnerable in terms of being able to defend their rights. Some people have described this as business as usual, but on steroids, right? So we found, as I said, that governments were aiding and abetting or turning a blind eye to land grabbing, that they were prioritizing these large-scale development activities in Indigenous peoples' territories over protecting their rights. And not just that, but they were weakening the safeguards for those rights. And we found that they were enacting policies and regulations and trying to pass laws that they could rush through during the pandemic that would weaken protection mechanisms like impact assessments, and that would facilitate systematic violations of rights. And when Indigenous peoples tried to protest and tried to assert their rights, they were being increasingly prosecuted. So this paints a very, very stark picture. And it's one that I think we all need to open our eyes to, because this doesn't just affect Indigenous peoples, it affects us all. When you think that these are the peoples that are the protectors of the biodiversity of the forest that we all rely on, then by undermining their rights, we're actually endangering the most effective solution for protecting the world's biodiversity. And you can't put a financial figure on this, but if you think about the fact that Indigenous peoples hold much of the world's biodiversity in their lands, and that biodiversity contributes around $33 trillion to the global economy, then you can start to see, just from a purely self-interest point of view, we should be using the law to do something about this. So Indigenous peoples themselves haven't taken this line down. And you see on the slide there pictures of groups from different parts of the world who have mobilized to assert their rights. And this is in a context where some of these groups are really facing existential threats to their existence. So it's not just a matter of losing a piece of land, because if they lose their lands, they lose their way of life, they lose their identity and existence as a people. So they've adopted a whole range of strategies, different strategies, to assert their rights and to demand respect for their rights. And among these strategies are taking legal actions against states. So they have successfully challenged states and corporations, both in the domestic laws of the countries in which they live, and also extraterritorially. So they're taking cases here in the UK, taking cases in the Netherlands, in the United States. And in addition to that, they're engaging with international mechanisms, so international human rights committees and regional human rights courts, and they're winning landmark cases that are changing our understanding of human rights and of the measures that states need to take to protect both the rights and the environment. They're also taking other very interesting measures, and this is where I find, my research is most stimulating when you go and engage with communities that are forming their own governments. So they're actually establishing they have their own traditional structures, but now they're coming together, many communities that have formed part of a people and creating their own autonomous governments. And they're demarcating their lands themselves. They're not waiting for the government to come and recognize the borders of their lands. They're saying, this is our borders, and they're mapping their lands and delimiting and demarcating those lands. And they're also documenting their own customary laws. So Indigenous peoples, as I said in the beginning, one of the characteristics of many peoples is that they have their own legal systems. And so what they're doing is documenting these legal systems and publishing that and sharing it with governments and corporations and saying, if you want to come onto my land and you want to proceed with a form of development that you are interested in, large-scale development, then you have to follow my rules of engagement, and you have to get my consent, my free, prior, and informed consent based on those rules. So those are some examples. Other examples are communities are forming their own Indigenous guards, their own environmental monitors, and they're patrolling their lands and checking for environmental harms, because in many cases there are already severe environmental harms in their lands. So they're monitoring for oil spills. They're monitoring the extent to which illegal actors are entering into their lands. And they're barricading access to their lands, and often for extended periods, often for years, communities have to try to physically block access to their land to prevent what they regard as development aggression or destructive development that's entering into their lands and being imposed on them. So there are two reports finish with a series of recommendations to governments, to companies, to civil society actors, to international organizations. And what we concluded is, while Indigenous peoples' actions are key to resolving these issues, they can't address these enormous challenges on their own. And what's really needed is a paradigm shift in respect for Indigenous peoples' rights. And this is critical just to guarantee their survival as peoples. And so governments need to revise all of their laws and ensure that those laws that discriminate against Indigenous peoples in the regulation of extractive industries, energy projects, agribusiness, and conservation, that they're reformed and that they're aligned with the rights of Indigenous peoples, and that barriers that Indigenous peoples face to access to justice are removed, and impunity for violating their rights is addressed. So these laws, it's not just good enough to have them on paper, but then they need to be enacted, right? They need to be enforced. And they need to ensure that corporate actors are actually respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. And it doesn't we don't stop at governments. The report talks about the need for all of us as a global society to recognize that Indigenous peoples and respect for their rights are essential, absolutely essential, for tackling the major challenges that we face as a global community, a global society. And that includes climate change and the conservation of biodiversity. And these rights, they're central to the realization of what today we call sustainable and inclusive development. And I'm sure you've all heard about the idea of sustainable development, but they're also critical to peace and security, because you see that many conflicts end up being about lands and resources, and they're often in those areas where Indigenous peoples are located. And not just that, but we need to protect Indigenous peoples' rights, because that's protecting the world's cultural heritage. And it's also protecting invaluable traditional knowledge that Indigenous peoples have that's key to our future and our sustainability ultimately. So the reports call on states and corporations and investors and conservation organizations to fully respect the rights of Indigenous peoples that are recognized in international law, and that development should only proceed in Indigenous peoples' lands if those rights are respected and their free, prior, and informed consent has been obtained in advance, right? And this is absolutely essential if Indigenous peoples are to exist and to flourish and to be able to have the futures that they want in their own lands. So that's an overview of those two pieces of research that I conducted over the past 2 years that hopefully will stimulate some interest. What I might do is open it up now to some questions, and we can have a bit of a discussion around this because it's a very broad topic. And then before we finish, I'll just take 5 minutes at the end to talk a little bit about the teaching and learning plans for the next year. So it's just to talk about how we're organizing and structuring ourselves around on-campus and online type teaching. So you're very welcome to raise some questions. I'm just going to stop the share of my video. So if anybody wants to turn their camera on, or if you want to speak, we can facilitate that. Or if you prefer, just enter your questions into the chat, and I can take them that way. So feel free. This is an informal chat, and it's an opportunity, maybe to ask a question about a topic that you've never thought about before, or is completely new to you, or maybe you have, and maybe this is something that you've actually come across in your own experience, or something you've read about, or you've seen in movies, or you're just generally interested about. So any question, there's no stupid question. There's just a challenging answer sometimes. So please feel free to go ahead.
I have a question. So yes. For a complete novice who actually is fascinated by this, you did mention some kind of resources to look at, but are there kind of any easily digestible books or kind of documentaries or resources that you would recommend to someone who maybe hasn't explored this before?
So there's a number. Maybe a good starting point is some of the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that work on this area, and there are 3 of those that come to mind. So if you go to their website, so one is Forest Peoples Program, FPP. Another one is IFGIA, which is the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs. And they do great publications and videos, and they give you a thematic overview of issues facing Indigenous peoples. And then the third one is Minority Rights Group International, MRG, and they cover Indigenous peoples issues, but also minority issues, because there's an overlap between these issues. And they also do great publications and videos. So that's a good starting point. And then as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, there are many documentaries, award-winning, brilliantly produced documentaries that address these types of issues. So there's I can share some of those if you're interested. If there's a distribution list, I could share some of those afterwards. But I put a couple of them on one of the slides. The Utopia one in Australia, for example. There's a great one on the Inuit and their history of seal hunting, and how that's endangered and how it's misunderstood. There's other documentaries about the Maori. So there's a huge amount of material there for somebody who just wants to get into this, and I can share some of that via email afterwards if that would be helpful. Great. So I see that in the chat that there's questions coming in. Let me see. What will we study in international law? How do you think we as people can create this sense of change through law or the general public? Okay, great questions. What requirements to apply for this course? Okay, so maybe what will we study in international law? So international law is a very broad topic, and this piece that I've just talked about is one part of that, right? So when you study international law, you'll be looking at the states and how states interact with each other. What are the rules for state interaction, recognition of states? And you look at how the UN system has been established. So you'd be looking at international organizations and essentially the agreements and treaties that have been entered into between states that regulate how states interact, and how states also, when we talk about international human rights law, which is part of international law, how they relate to people and individuals who live within the state, right? So international law really is, how the global order is maintained. And obviously it's very closely related with international relations and politics. But you'll be looking at treaties, you'll be looking at bodies like the International Court of Justice and how it resolves disputes between states, because states have disputes between each other. But there's also, within the human rights context, there's also opportunities for individuals to take their cases against states to international mechanisms or regional mechanisms. So it's a very broad, fascinating area of law that, again, if you're interested, maybe I can point you to some kind of short outlines that would give you a sense of what would be embodied in this study of international law. So the second question then, how do you think we as people can create this sense of change through law or the general public? So yeah, that's a topic that we could have a long chat about, but it's something, I suppose, that it's not immediately obvious, because it sometimes seems that problems are so big and so intractable and have such long histories, because we're talking about peoples who for 500 years have been subject to discrimination. But there are many efforts ongoing to try to address this. So if you think, for example, of commodities that we buy. So we buy, if you look at much of our food products has palm oil ingredients in there, right? And there are initiatives to try to have some form of responsible production of palm oil, and to certify that process. And part of that certification is looking at the protection of Indigenous land rights in the production of palm oil. Now, you find the same thing in relation to paper products. So you'll see FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, for example. If you buy a tub of yogurt, it'll probably be on the carton there. Now, there's many initiatives across all kinds of sectors where there's commodities that we buy, and they're new initiatives, and they haven't really so far delivered on the promise, but they're one mechanism that we have. Another is, if you engage, when you start to engage in the law, then that's a first point as a consumer. Second part, if you study law and you engage with the law, then, and this is what I've been doing for nearly 20 years, there's a huge need to kind of be the translator between the communities and their situations and the legal mechanisms and the quasi-legal mechanisms that are there, to use that as a lever for change. So there are examples of emblematic and landmark cases taken against states that lay out exactly what the state needs to do. And that then serves as in the process of advocacy. The law by itself won't make the change. We need to then, engage with the politics of this, right? And work with communities in solidarity with groups and build networks. The formation of links between communities in the Amazon and groups in, for example, London is now so much easier because of technology. And we're really, mobilizing much more effectively internationally as a result of this. And one of the evidence of this is that we have a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples that was accepted now by all governments. And that really resulted as out of the mobilization of Indigenous communities who are among the most vulnerable and disempowered groups. They managed to get the governments of the world to agree to, some very strong language about their right to self-determination, their rights over their lands. So that's the first step. You get that recognition in law, and then you have to go and try and get it implemented. So it's a constant struggle, depending on what level you want to get involved in. If you want to get involved at the community level, then you go like I've done, and you spend long periods working with particular communities, understanding their context, their situation, and working with them, being guided by them in terms of how to actually articulate their rights and engage with mechanisms. Or you can take a much more higher level, and you can be working within a UN system, trying to help establish new norms, or you can try to lobby governments, like lobby the British government, to ensure that whenever it's encouraging or promoting its companies' operations overseas, that it has some form of due diligence, and it requires them to conduct impact assessments and it's transparent about this, and that there's some form of sanction, that the law here actually is designed to address, when things go wrong. So that's it's a fascinating but long question. So I'll move on to the next one, which is what are the requirements to apply for this course? So this is what I've talked about. I'm not sure if you're asking about this subject or if you're asking about an LLB or law degree in general. But if you want to look at the requirements for the law degree in general, I can direct you to the web page, and they'll be specified there what the entry requirements are. But for a course like this, so we have, as part of the law program, there are modules on international law and international human rights law, and I give some lectures on the international human rights law part of the course. So in that, then once you're on the program, you have the opportunity to apply for that course. So I think maybe you're clarifying the question there. So let's move on to the next one. Well, can a LV3 BTech business student apply for this course? Okay, again, I'm not level 3 BTech. So I'm not sure I've understood that question. It's somebody who's taking a business degree, is it? And you're interested in taking a module, is it? Or are you interested in switching to law? Maybe you could clarify the question, because I'm not fully sure what the question is. Then this other question: I'm working on my personal statement for international law degree, but I haven't done anything for work experience in the last year because of COVID. Is there anything I can do in the next few months you'd recommend to help my application? Again, maybe just clarify for me what you're applying for. Is it an undergraduate degree? Is it a master's degree? So that's one thing. But then in terms of what you could do, so in the next few months, it's a challenging time, right? To get work experience. I suppose I nearly need to talk to you one-on-one to know where you're coming from, what it is you want to do. But just informing yourself and reading around the area is probably the best. Maybe writing to inquire about the courses from the program leaders. If it's I'm a program leader for the master's courses, so if somebody was interested in studying master's courses, they can contact me, and I will tell them a little bit about the particular programs and maybe what might be helpful. So I think it's a specific question that if I knew what particular course you were applying for and a little bit about your own background and what you're interested in, and then I could maybe give you a better answer to that. So let me see. In the future, as students, would we be able to make newsletters on this area of law to the university in order to help blogging? Yes, that's a good and creative suggestion. As students, you have a lot of power, actually. If you think about students globally, even if you think about students in the UK, you have a very latent power because of your numbers, because of your energy, because of your enthusiasm, because of your ability to organize. I mean, we've seen that with how, in the context of climate issues, how it's young people who have pushed this onto the agenda. And definitely, you could, get involved in newsletters. Students' union could be engaged to have talks on this and to see how you could work together as a union or with other universities. There's a huge area there, and with some organizations. So I've done some work with the London Mining Network that looks at the impact of mining in different parts of the world, and they engage with students and student unions, and so there's definitely opportunities there for that kind of collaboration. And it's interesting because you, as a student, you bring out maybe a legal dimension, and you can apply what you're studying to this specific context, and in so doing, you're learning, but you're also contributing. So that I think, if you are interested, you can always come back to me, and I can help you think that through a little bit. So is there any way to contact the law department directly? So if you're applying to for a program, if you go on the website, there'll be the program leader will be named there, and you can contact that program leader. So as I said, I'm the program leader for the master's degree. So you can contact me if you're thinking of applying for a master's degree. If you're applying for an undergraduate degree, just look up who is the program leader, and you can always send an email, and the person, I'm sure, will do their best to get back to you. You know, if it's a specific query that you have. So will Navy law be part of international law? So again, Valentina, I'm not sure if you're asking about undergraduate but in international law in general, maritime law would form part of that, right? So you have dedicated subjects on maritime law. If you're at a master's level, you can take a dedicated subject on that. But you know, as a general international law module, you would be looking at maritime law. You'd be looking at the law of the sea. The law of the sea is one of the kind of the foundational areas in international law, core and very important part of international law, because it's, you know, about regulating activities on the seas that are not part of any territory of any state. So it's kind of where international law in part started out of that area. So yes, definitely. Do you think it's worth? Sorry, do you think it is worth it pursuing a degree in law in regard to future professional possibilities? Also, is divorce? Yeah. So law opens up a whole range of career paths. It's not just legal practice. If you, for example, if you look at politics, you look at politicians, you see that most of the senior politicians have studied law. You know, law kind of equips you with an understanding of how the world works, of its structures, its institutions. It also equips you with a reasoning. There's a logic that you apply, and that can be transferred, you know, to any area of law. If you want to get into family law, I think, you know, there's always work in family law, and there always will be. But there are many other areas of law that, you know, that you can look into that are growing and, you know, evolving. And I think when you start studying law, you know, you might start out with one idea: I'm interested in this area of law, but you might end up finding that there's another area that absolutely fascinates you. So I think law is it's always a good degree in terms of career possibilities. And, you know, like every area, there's competition. So, you know, if you take the degree, you have to work harder to get a good degree, you know, to enable you to kind of to compete in that marketplace. But you know, companies hire people with law degrees to work in their law departments. I mean, if you think of any sector, really, law kind of is necessary. So let me see the next question. What are the requirements for an undergraduate degree for this course, as in international law? Reason I asked is because I'm a full-time job agent. Yeah, online course like this will suffice for me. Thanks. Okay, so that question I'll come back to in a few minutes, but that question about online, offline, because I have a couple of slides I want to share with you. But we're going to have what we call a blended, a mix of online, offline. So it's they're full-time courses that are traditionally on campus, but now we have, because of the COVID context, we have a mix of both online and on-campus teaching. I would suggest, if you have a question that's specific about your particular situation, maybe you can email me afterwards, and I can try to follow up and get a particular answer for you, because I don't have the answer in terms of have somebody who's full-time, if there's some way to try and work around that. But in general, you know, they're courses that require students to be, the undergraduate courses require students to be on campus. The master's courses, we have students who are working full-time, but they take, you know, a certain number of hours off each week in order to attend the courses. And this year, obviously, everything was almost online, but next year we'll be shifting to a mix of on-campus and online. So overall, for the law degree, what would be the general timetables? What would the general timetable be like, such as the uni lesson timing and face-to-face interaction virtual? Okay, so let me share these, because these last questions are bringing me to where I wanted to get to, and we can have a couple of minutes on this. on till I just get the right. Sorry, I've got two screens, so sometimes I'm not sure what's showing up when I do the share. So when we get
just while you're doing that, can I just
yeah.
to the person that was asking about personal statements and not having any work experience to refer to, this might have applied to other people who are looking to do a undergraduate degree with us. There is a really great website, and it's called The Forage. So it's the Forage, spelled forage.com, and they are a really good website created by a company called Rate My Apprenticeships, and they offer virtual online work experience and internships that you can do from the comfort of your own home, which can go quite a long way in helping to support you with that kind of work experience element for some of the courses that you're interested in, and it gives you something to write about as part of your personal statement. Also, attending lectures like this is something that you can use towards your experience in your chosen area of law. You can write about your experiences here, questions that you asked, and all of that sort of stuff as well within your personal statement. So do take that on board.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's great. So you can, I think I've shared my screen, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so you can see here we put together just a few slides that are around teaching and learning in the coming year. And obviously, you know, we've learned a lot in the last year. Every university had to switch very abruptly to an online form of teaching. And so we ask our students, you know, for their perceptions and their experiences. And based on the feedback that we received, we're adapting now, you know, how we're going to deliver our programs next year. We're trying to be as innovative as we can in doing that. So the idea, and because of the constraints in terms of large numbers of people, is that for very large lectures, will be focused, you know, they'll be delivered through an online platform, and then the on-campus sessions will be more focused on building that sense of community, because that's something that was clearly lacking the last year because students weren't able to come together. You know, it's one of the really important parts about doing a university degree, and your experience is actually spending time and having that community, and it's, you know, it's key to development. So, you know, we'll try to combine these two to give the best learning experience possible, because there's advantages of the online and there's advantages, you know, on person, and, you know, make use of all the combination of resources from video and podcasts, and, you know, we have virtual support, so I have office hours with students online, and, you know, to facilitate interaction as well between students. So that's actually something that we also learned this last year, that sometimes you can collaborate online in ways that you mightn't have been able to do on campus, because you have to come together and meet physically, which in a city like London, you know, isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do. So by doing this online experience, we actually saw, well, there's ways to help students to collaborate that way as well. And then, you know, the way our approach to assessments is always, you know, trying to take the theory and what you study and apply that, you know, to real life context that would be relevant to your future career. So it's not just about exams, you know, it's about doing coursework and building portfolios, and different models of assessment. So I think that's also, you know, more interesting and dynamic for students. And then, you know, from the perspective of the law department, we have specific kind of features, because each department has its own, you know, requirements. If you're studying engineering and you need to be in a lab, it's very different from studying law. So what we really want to try to do is have this kind of best of both worlds, and you know, really realize what we call a blended approach to learning. So you have your online, which gives you flexibility, but you also have your on-campus, which gives you interaction and engagement. And the small groups on campus will really, you know, enable a kind of interaction and a dynamic kind of an environment where you can share and learn from each other, because learning from each other is really almost as important, I think, or maybe even more important sometimes than learning from the lecturer, because you share experiences, and that's how you build your, you have to listen to others, engage with their views. You might disagree with them, but you have to formulate your arguments, and law is all about that, building your arguments and having a kind of a reasoned response. But also, this very important part, as I said, of having a sense of community and belonging, to the university and to your cohort. So we then, just in terms of the practical side, we record, when lectures are online, we record them all so they're accessible as well. And you have those, and that's helpful too. I think students are able to refer back. You're not just reliant on the notes that you took in a lecture. And we also, keep things short, so you have smaller segments that you can access. And as I said, using the various tools that technology gives us. So I, for example, use quizzes sometimes. I was going to use one today, but I thought that we didn't have time. You had the kind of options where you can type in word maps, where I ask you a question, you all type in your ideas and the words appear and it collates them, and you get kind of an idea of the kind of the opinions of a group very quickly, and it can be a very effective way to facilitate discussion. One of the great things about the online world is that you can bring in people to speak who, might be on the other side of the world. I bring people, Aboriginal speakers can talk from Australia about their experience to a class that, we just couldn't do that otherwise. So that's, one of the positives. And then we really do try to be as responsive and supportive as we can in the law school. And there's a tutor, you have a personal tutor who's there for you. And yeah, our models of assessment are, quite diverse. We first of all, you have assessments that are aimed at helping you to learn. So we've got informative assessments. They're not, you're not marked on those, but it's a way to practice, a way to build your skills, a way to gain an understanding of what's expected of you. And then, model answers that can guide you as well. And, we have matrix, or in all the undergraduate programs, it's a matrix for marking, so you know what's expected of you. And there's a quote up there from an LLB student who said the online lectures and seminars were very engaging, and they're very grateful for the effort that's put into them, and to make sure that they have the best learning experience during this difficult time. So I think it's been a challenging year for everybody, but both staff and students, I think, have tried to make the best of it, and I was really impressed with the work that the students did this past year. Actually, in some cases, it was even better than in normal circumstances, maybe because there was no time to enjoy yourself and you're just sitting working, but the output was good. Yeah, and then the last slide is just talking about the start of the term. We probably have some specific plans, because there'll be people coming from overseas, and we're all of this is in kind of in flux, because we don't know what the situation is actually going to be come September. But assuming that the regulations, the government is saying as it is now that we can be on campus, then we'll have that blend. But we'll have plans in place to address whatever scenario is there, whether we have strict social distancing or whether that's not as necessary, because vaccinations have been rolled out and things are less critical. And then, yeah, if you're an overseas student, as it says there, excuse me, then excuse me, so yeah, then if you're overseas and there's a restriction in terms of traveling, then we'll aim to support you online until you can come to the UK. And if you have questions about this, then yeah, just please get in touch. So that's kind of as much as we know right now, because the broader context obviously determines what the university is able to do. But for now, this is our plan, and we're catering to different eventualities. But the real, I suppose, the core message is that we aim to have a mix of online and on campus try to take advantage of the best of both worlds, and we make all efforts to ensure that you're both benefiting from the course academically, but also personally in terms of your interaction with the staff, but more importantly, I think your interaction with other students. So let me go back to the questions. So what do you think? Do you think it's worth pursuing a degree in law with regard to future? That one I answered, yeah. What's the most demand jobs? So what I guess what jobs are most in demand for people who graduate from law? Well, I think you have the traditional route, solicitor, barrister route. That isn't what most students end up doing. That's a certain percentage. And there are various reasons for that. One is it's extremely competitive, so there's a limited pool there, so there's only a certain percentage that can end up there. But another is that there's very attractive work, and increasingly work within either government, within industry, even education. If you're I suppose the world is your oyster a little bit with a law degree, but there is a big demand in the corporate world for people with legal expertise. So if you're interested in business law, if you're interested in the areas that I work in, with Indigenous and tribal peoples, or in human rights in general, you have international organizations like the UN, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, the OECD, and then you have NGOs, non-governmental organizations. All of these people need lawyers, need people with law degrees. If you think about customs, Brexit, in the context of the UK, there's a whole area of law that's opened up there where there's new demand. So it changes over time, depending on what's happening more broadly in the world. But there's a spectrum of areas that you can work in with a law degree. I'm not sure what would be where most of the demand is coming from, but definitely a large section of the demand comes from business, and there's quite a focus on business law as a result. But there's opportunities for, I suppose, every interest really in the legal area. What are the qualities of Middlesex University in regard to law that makes it stand out from other universities? Moreover, what support does Middlesex University give? Okay. Well, I think maybe a few things. I suppose one is our student body, and also our staff. I think we have a really interesting, dynamic, diverse, and engaged group. So if you come on campus, hopefully that would be what we have come September, October, you see that there are people from all over the world, and they bring with them different backgrounds, different cultures, different understandings, different ideas, and that's really enriching in the context of studying law, because law is about how our societies work and how we respect each other, how we engage. So, and that's one of the strengths of Middlesex, and it's an area we focus on. So the staff, the researchers, who would be lecturing you, are drawing from their own engagement with these issues. So it's not just textbook. It's actually like people like me who study for long periods of time a particular area of law, human rights law, and then when teaching that, draw from the examples that they have encountered in their own work and that they've written about in their research. And I think that's one of the kind of strong points in Middlesex, and there are areas then where we have very deep expertise, and I think in business law is one, human rights law is another, for example. So those are two areas and that intersection of this business and corporate responsibility is also an area that I think is becoming increasingly in demand. Actually, well, I know it is, because there's the biggest forum in the UN is actually the Business and Human Rights Forum. Annually, have thousands of people go to this, and businesses are realizing they have to adapt to how they engage with broader societal issues, such as human rights, the environment, climate change, sustainable development. Then in terms of support, as I said, there's a personal tutor that you have access. We're very accessible. Your lectures are always accessible. It's office hours. They're there to discuss with you. We this year that was online, but and I think it's worked pretty well. Normally, the normal circumstances, there's hours where I'm in my office. You can just come and even if I don't teach you and you're interested in my area, I'm very happy to talk to you. And that's how in general I think the staff are in Middlesex. There's a real, I suppose, student focus, and it's not just about passing you out material and then leaving you off. It's really trying to help you through the journey, of building your expertise and your skills. So there's a focus on skills and knowledge and bringing that together, based on practical experience. Then what would we study in human rights law? So human rights law, so I teach a module on human rights law that I split down into in sort of 3 ways. I look at international human rights law. So what are the standards at the international level? And when I talk about the standards, I'm talking about treaties that have been developed by within the UN system that address civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, the rights of migrants, the rights of women, the rights of children, and so the racial discrimination. And there's 9 of these treaties, so that's one big part of it. You'd be looking at, where do these standards come from? What do they say, and how are they applied in practice? So that, it's that kind of broad overview. And then we zoom into regions, because if you think about Africa, Asia, Latin America, there's regional human rights systems, and there's a lot to study about how they have contextualized the law within the particular regions that they're responsible for monitoring. And then we drill down a step further and look at a national level. How is the standards that have been developed at the international or regional level being translated into practice? And that's where you come to the types of issues that I'm talking about earlier, which is minorities and Indigenous peoples, and looking at how a state and its legal system treats these peoples is really kind of the litmus test of whether law is serving as a tool for justice or a tool to maintain privilege and the status quo. So going right down into kind of at the local level and drawing on cases, and so you'd be analysing the application of international law and international human rights law in specific contexts. And then the other thing that I do is I take thematic sort of perspective. So I look at the issue of business and human rights and how the corporate world is engaging with this. I look at sustainable development and human rights and how that, what's the intersection there. We look at issues like statelessness, so groups that don't have a nationality and are denied all rights essentially, because the right to nationality is almost the right to have rights. So pick a number of these kind of thematic cross-cutting issues and look at those. So it's a fascinating area, because if you think of human rights law, you're thinking about humans, it's all of us, and you're thinking about the law and how do these things come together. It's I really enjoy that module, because what we do is bring in, I call it the all-star team. We bring in people from the entire law faculty to co-teach it. People who work in, some people, we have lawyers who are taking the leading cases in the European Court of Human Rights, and they're on, they're part of the faculty. We have lawyers that work on looking at the UN system and how it's developed. We have lawyers who work on Indigenous and minority rights issues like me. We have people who work on statelessness. And so there's a whole people who are experts in international criminal law or international humanitarian law. We have one of the leading experts on the death penalty as well. So we basically try to make it as rich, as broad, but as rich as possible by having people talk about what they really know in great depth. So yeah, if you want more information on that one, you can always contact me, and I'm happy to share it with you. So I hope that was somewhat useful in terms of giving you a flavor for, first of all, a subject, a topic that, is would be part of what you'd be studying if you're in my module anyway. You would be definitely hearing an awful lot more about Indigenous and tribal peoples and minorities and development. I didn't even get into the whole question of how Indigenous peoples perceive development, because it's something completely different maybe, and I was just talking about mainstream development and how it impacts them. So I hope it got a little taste for that, and also a little bit of an understanding of how the law department works and what the student experience is, and what it hopefully can be in the coming year. The last question there: would we have the opportunities to visit court for experience? Yes. So we organize, for example, visits to the court in Strasbourg as part of the human rights area, so the European Court of Human Rights. But yes, so that would be there's a number of layers to that question maybe. So you can there's a legal clinic opportunity to work in a legal clinic where you're actually engaging on specific issues. There's a moot court that we set up, so you have a practice moot court competitions where you're actually acting out, and then we bring barristers on campus to talk to students about their experience, and then arranging, visiting a court and actually getting an insight into the operations of the court. There's nothing like that, I suppose, to really get a sense for law in action, and then there's also the opportunity, to try and get internships or try to connect with practitioners. But again, this is a very competitive area, so there's no guarantee of that. That's but the university will facilitate as much as it can connections, so you can build your networks and introduce you to people who are working in this area. And if you have questions, again, kind of more specific questions on that, if you want to follow up with me, I can put you in contact with people who oversee the legal clinic and who are more involved in that practice side of things, because we have a dedicated lecturer who's focused on the legal practice area. So I think we're over time. It's Friday afternoon, and I'm sure you're all looking forward to something more maybe relaxing than a lecture on Indigenous peoples and a discussion on Middlesex University Law Department. But I do hope that it's been helpful. Can I type in my email address in here, or
I've sent round to the people that have asked your staff.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, you sent to whoever asked you for it, and then I can follow up with them on specific questions.
If there are anyone, or if there is anyone, sorry, who hasn't got that detail, you can see it on the answered questions on your Q&A screen. But I'm more than happy to send that around again, the staff profile. So just pop in the Q&A now and I can do that. As a reminder, you can watch this back on demand. Just click the link that you signed in with and you'll be able to view it back again. Yeah, otherwise this has been really, really interesting, and I'm sure everyone else has found it as fascinating as I have. There's been some really, really great discussions. Yeah, that's all I've got to say. I don't know if you've got anything else.
No, I also enjoyed it. I suppose the difference between this and what we do in, at least in my lectures, is that, there's usually people have their cameras on and we're talking, so it's more interactive. So this isn't exactly what, your online experience would be. I mean, it depends. If you're on a very big lecture, then you're probably more in this mode of engagement. But it's nice when we all see each other and talk, and then you get to know people. So it's not, an online class isn't exactly like this, but at least you get a sense for the fact that it's possible to have some sort of a sharing, even in a limited way like this. But I'm available for those of you who had specific questions. Just follow up with me, and I'll put you in contact with the person that I think is best placed to answer your question. And yeah, just wish you all a nice long weekend. And I don't know, maybe some of you are in different parts of the world, and wherever you are, it's morning, noon, or night. Yeah, that you have a nice remainder of the day. And yeah, happy to reply to any further questions that you have by email.
Great, thank you. Nothing else has come in now on the Q&A, so I am going to end the meeting. But yeah, last chance to ask for Carl's email. Otherwise, I'll end the meeting and wish you all, just to echo your points on wishing everyone a lovely long weekend, and see you all soon.
Yes, yeah, hopefully see you all soon. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you all.